Yes, thank you, Andrea. Andrea Reed at the Indigenous Fishery Center at the UBC. So the first item at our agenda today is key issues and knowledge gap in circumpolar salmon people research with a focus on salmon river management in Sápmi. So I will have with me a group of people, and I ask Steinar and Tero and Mackenzie to come up to the podium together with me. So I will start off with the introduction in just a few moments. We have a problem with indigenous size. I have to stand a little like this, but if somebody could bring me something to stand on, that would be even better. Yes, so my name is Camilla Brattland. I'm an associate professor at UiT, the Arctic University of Norway, at the University Museum. And I'm going to talk about some issues and knowledge gap in circumpolar salmon people research, and I think it's a nice way to start off this to give you an overview of the field. Not sure how this is working. Okay, the big green button. Yes. So together with me, I have 3 other presenters, and I will present them when they are coming up to do their different parts of the presentation. But first up, I will start with talking a little bit about previous salmon people initiatives. This international gathering of the salmon is not the first initiative to try to gather salmon peoples from around the circumpolar region. There have been mainly other regional attempts, and I would like Mackenzie now to come up and join me, and we will talk a little bit about these previous initiatives. I will just get the bio.
Okay, thanks so much. Thanks, everyone. So in the early phases of planning for this gathering a couple of months ago, I wanted to make sure that while the planning team was coming together, we weren't going to duplicate any kind of past initiatives. Since I'm from this region, I wanted to look at some of the initiatives that have happened in the Pacific Basin that have sought to collect and amplify Indigenous voices around salmon. So I looked at 3 initiatives that happened between 2005 and 2015, and my objective of this review was to examine their structure, the scope of their participation, and the outcomes that were generated at these initiatives, and then see what we could learn for the International Gathering of Indigenous Salmon Peoples here today. So the first initiative that I looked at was a conference that happened in Kamchatka in 2008 that was co-organized with the United Nations Development Program and 2 environmental NGOs in Kamchatka. It seemed to dovetail with 2 initiatives that the United Nations Development Program had ongoing at the time. The English language material was a little bit scarce, so it was difficult for me to sift through, but it seemed like the project had a real issue with meaningful and legitimate engagement with the Itelmen people there, and that was definitely a failure that could have been remedied with better participation. The second initiative that I looked at was a book that was published in 2015 entitled The River of Salmon Peoples. This book collected conversations that happened along the Fraser River watershed with First Nations there after a series of consultations that took a couple of years prior to the book's publication. There was some thematic curation of what folks were saying about salmon and their relationships to salmon in chapters, but for the most part, I think the interesting thing about this book is that it collected in an unparaphrased way the voices of salmon peoples. And the third initiative that I looked into was an environmental and anthropological anthology entitled Keystone Nations, edited by Benedict Columbi and James Brooks, and published in 2012. I'm sure lots of us have come across this book. It's pretty seminal in this field, and it collected chapters from 10 research specialists focused on 8 ethnographic case studies about people and salmon in the Pacific Rim. It came out of a seminar that was held in 2010 in Santa Fe in the US state of New Mexico. It was a good starting point, but I think the critique to be had now, especially in 2022, is a matter of representation. Obviously, no volume can be exhaustive, and we've seen in this room just how long it takes to make sure that everybody is heard and that their voices can resonate in a meaningful way. It takes time, and not every book can capture everything, but you're going to need volumes to contain the voice of every salmon people across the Pacific, let alone across the Salmosphere and the multiple hemispheres that we're working with. So while I think the geographical scope might have been lacking, there's not as much that could be done about that as the lack of representation in authorship. Out of 10 researchers who contributed to this book, it seems that only one self-identified as Indigenous, and that seems like a real problem. My takeaways for organizers of events like this is to be as broadly representative and directly representative as possible. So not only casting your net geographically in a wide way, but making sure that the net is reaching people directly who are engaged in salmon management and are themselves Indigenous salmon managers. An argument that might have been used in this curation of perspectives for Keystone Nations was that there weren't enough Indigenous salmon voices, but hearing the amount of salmon voices in this room in the past couple days, it's obvious that that couldn't be further from the truth, and those voices have always been there. So, thanks.
Okay, that's better. Thank you so much, Mackenzie. And Mackenzie Kermode is an international environmental jurist who specializes in climate law and law of the marine environment. She has a Master of Laws from the University of Edinburgh's Global Environment and Climate Change program. So I'm really happy to have worked together with Mackenzie to gather this overview of Salmon People initiatives, and you can also read more about her the presentation that she held now in a paper that just came out in August. So we can provide a link to that a little later. Yes, so what I will, or our panel will talk about today, what are key issues in Salmon People research? First, I will talk a little bit about 2 key concepts that I think we all are concerned with: Indigenous participation in self-determination in salmon management and Indigenous participation in knowledge production. So first, I will start with giving you a little overview of a review that we did of key literature in the field, and then we will have 2 cases to locate Sami salmon people from the Detno and Natamo rivers that will end our presentations. For the Saltkull project that I'm a part of, and who was also one of the initiators of this academic seminar, we did a review, me and my colleagues, of literature. And to do a review, you'd need a theoretical standpoint and some analytical concepts to think with. So as for myself, I'm a coastal Sami. I'm also an associate professor in Sami culture, history and research at the Norwegian Arctic University. What I bring to this analysis is really an attempt to try to think about what does participation mean from all kinds, not only a natural science perspective, a social science perspective, but to try to bring together different disciplines in thinking about participation. So when we think about participation, it can mean many different things. For the review, we try to come up with some typologies of participation in management. So as you can see from the slide here, if it's possible to turn the lights down in the room, it's also easier for the audience to see the slides. So at the lowest step of the ladder, and this is just adapted from Shelley Arnstein's paper from 1969, the lowest ladder of participation is exclusion or informal participation, that people do not participate in state-led management. Second, it could be anything from tokenism to being ignored to just being paid lip service in state management processes. Co-management is a concept that's very popular and often an ideal, but throughout the discussions we had the last days, I think that this is also more and more being questioned, as opposed to when it comes to indigenous peoples' representation in management, that we should have self-governance. So where you could kind of place or typologize yourself or your case or your people depends on a range of issues, but one key dimension could be, or I think is, indigenous empowerment in indigenous state relations. So it depends on the degree of power, equity, degree of recognition of indigenous rights and jurisdictions in each case, where you would place yourself on this ladder. When it comes to knowledge production, how can we think about participation in knowledge production for salmon management? Within the Western science integration model, you could think about participation as trying to integrate traditional knowledge, for instance, with natural sciences, with biological salmon conservation perspectives, for instance. But there are other ways of thinking about participation as well. In the multiple knowledge systems approach, we have concepts such as two-eyed seeing, weaving of knowledges. You could also think about moving beyond participation and actually thinking about co-production. And here again, the key dimension is the power differences in indigenous knowledge and Western science relations. So here I try to visualize the degree of equity in power next to Maria Tengu's concept of diverse knowledge systems, trying to show that when knowledge systems are furthest apart, there's an inequity in knowledge production for, if we think about knowledge production for salmon management, and we strive towards equity between different knowledge systems. So the research group for salmon, for the Salkul project, which is an abbreviation for salmon and culture, it's led by the Norwegian Institute for Nature Research in Norway and funded by the Norwegian Research Council. We searched the Web of Science for literature with search terms such as salmon, indigenous knowledge and participation in the period between 2000 and 2021, published in that period. Our search resulted in 83 peer-reviewed articles, and we went more into 38 relevant cases. Not only papers, but also special issues such as Alaska Salmon and People by Carl Rudders and colleagues, and edited books like The Keystone Nations were also part of the review. There were some papers that were most cited, such as Julie Raymond Yakubian's paper on incorporation of traditional knowledge into Alaska federal fisheries management. And the literature in general is, of course, dominated by North American and North Pacific literature. But there is an emerging body of literature also from our region, from Sápmi. One of the reasons for that knowledge gap in the literature is, of course, that we are not native English speakers, publish a lot of literature in other languages than English, but this review was only directed at English language literature. So, if I go back a little bit, this table shows an overview where we try to place the different cases in the papers on the ladder of participation. There are some good examples, like Columbia River, Atnarco River, the Heiltsuk Nation, and I will also point to our own example from the Natamo, which Tero will talk about later. But in general, it's really hard to do this exercise. So I will show it now, but I'm not sure that will actually go into the paper. But in general, it's easier to place cases in the middle stages of participation rather than in high or low. But some cases are really easy to point out as being on the lowest step of the ladder, which Steinar will talk about in the case of the Detno River also. Yes, so where are actually Sami salmon people on this ladder of participation? And we can think about participation also at different scales, international, national, and local. At the international and national level of participation, you could say that in the case of the Norwegian Sami, the Sami Parliament has participated in NASCO as observer since 2010. They also consult with the Norwegian government on national salmon regulations. They struggle to consult on farmed salmon policies. But there is no Sami participation in knowledge production, such as in national salmon scientific boards, such as the Scientific Board for Salmon Research, Vitenskapelig råd for lakseforvaltning. So then when we come to the local or bilateral level, we can start to think about Sapmi, salmon rivers and people. So now I will turn it over to Steinar and Tero to present our two rivers, which I hope you understood by now. We can categorize as being all over the scale of participation. The Detno River in many cases on the bottom of the ladder, and Njatam or Natamo on the top or in the middle. So Detno means a big river in Sami language. You could also think about it as the mother of rivers. It's the largest Atlantic salmon river in Europe. The main difference between these two cases is that there is no recognition of particular Sami fishing rights on the Detno River, while there is a recognition of Scotch Sami fishing rights in the case of Natamo, which really has an impact, I think, on the way those cases can move up or down that ladder. Yeah, so I thought that I would, let's see if I thought, yeah, this is my last slide before I give it over to Steinar and Tero. So in general, to sum up, you could say that there is a degree of, when we think about what gaps and issues are there in the field. In general, you could say that there is a lack of an international forum for local and indigenous fisheries and salmon peoples at the international level. In our case, for the Sapmi, it's a lack of recognition of indigenous fishing rights and jurisdictions, with some exceptions. There is a lack of formal participation of traditional knowledge holders or experts in national and local scientific fora, and there is too little research, which we heard from many of the discussions over the 2 days that we had together on other rivers than the iconic large salmon rivers. So I thought I'd try to think about this also in terms of empowerment, equity, and inequity. So I will then give the floor to Steinar. He will talk about the Detno River. And Steinar, he is born in 1947. He's a Sami historian, lives and works in the Sea Sami community of Denodat. During his career as a researcher at the Nordic Sami Institute, he has researched historical Sami fishing rights and currently works on topics concerning Sami rights to use natural resources according to common law. He has been a Sami Secretary of State, a political advisor to the Norwegian Minister of Local Government and Regional Development. He is also a former member of the Sami Parliament of Norway and the Regional County Council of Finnmark. He is a respected elder, both locally and regionally, and for this gathering he speaks also on behalf of the Deno Coastal and River Fisheries Management Group, which we heard from yesterday. So Steinar, I will give the floor to you. Legge bordet.
Good friends, thanks to Camilla here. Yesterday, Ben Larsen, the chair of the board of Tana Fishery Management, told us that In 1921 and 1922, there has been a total ban on fishing salmon in the Tana River and in the Tana Fjord and in the coast west and east of the Tana Fjord. And that's something which never has happened before. But I have I have seen no signs of no tokens from the Norwegian and Finnish authorities to take. I have not seen that they are taking any responsibility for the situation, because they are the sole ones which are responsible for what has happened. Since the state authorities of the two countries, the ministries of the two countries, are those who are in charge of the making the rules, all rules for fishing in the Tana River. And we have regulations concerning both the research and management of renewable resources. I remind you of the Convention on UN Convention on Biodiversity, and in Norway we have the Nature Conservation Act, which where both are stating that the basic knowledge of management should be biological research and traditional knowledge. But I'm not quite sure whether, I am sure that those principles aren't followed when you talk about the salmon stocks, 30 salmon stocks of the Tana River. The traditional knowledge is totally set aside. And if we look at a very short look at the history of the Tana River, we can see that the Sami people along the river has had many different ways of keeping, especially the predators, at the low level. And I think that the predator situation in Tana is one of the main reasons why we have come up into the tragic situation we are. Because the predators, the last 40 or 50 years, it's a ban on regulating the predators. If you are a criminal, if you shoot different birds, for example gooseanders, which eat salmon juveniles in great quantities, and it's forbidden to take eggs from those birds, and as people did earlier, which was also an important food supply. The otter, an expert to catch grown-up salmons, has been totally protected for exactly 40 years along the watershed. And the seal, as you know, many of you know, is also an outstanding salmon hunter. But it has also been, it's also for 40 years been defined as a holy creature. And why? In 1992, the estuary of the Tana River was made the nature reservation, made a nature reservation area. And since then, it has been forbidden to hunt seals there. And now there are many hundreds, between 300 and 500 seals gathered in the estuary area. And in 1922, there were something between 15 and 20. There has been enormous increase. And the gooseander has for hundreds of years, as I mentioned, been known as a fierce enemy of juvenile salmon. And during the summer, many of them are along the upstreams, the watershed. But at the in the late summer, early autumn, 30,000 gooseanders also flock and crowd in that estuary area. But they are forbidden to hunt. And in earlier times, not only salmon, but also other species of fish was the diet of the Samis along the river. It was the pike, sea trout, grayling, burbot or eelpout, and perch. Mostly of those are effective predators on juvenile salmon. But in the post-war period, it has been imposed strong limitations on using nets with smaller meshes. And that's made it impossible to keep down the different stocks of the mentioned fishes. And they have increased the predation on juvenile salmon. So today you have an enormous increased number of a wide range of predators, waterborne, airborne, and landborne. And the researchers and the authorities are not able, or they will not see the negative sum effects, the total effects, the gathered effects of all these. And here we are at the main clashing point when it is about the management of the Tana River. The biologists, which the managing authorities of Finland and Norway rely on, deny that predators have any negative impact. I have many noticed some sayings from them, and in one of the reports they asked, "Is predation a threat for Tana salmon stocks?" No. Answer: the short and simple answer to this is no. Predation as a mechanism simply does not work in a way that would allow for a negative stock development caused by increased predation. And also they claim that the Tana River has not been affected by any technical encroachments like hydroelectric plants or things like that. Therefore, the river is in a natural balance. And the predators and the salmon, have adjusted themselves to each other since the last glacial period, 8 or 10,000 years ago. And for that reason, predator control will do more harm than use. I could accept the postulate that predation does no harm if the natural environment never had been influenced by man. But when was the natural environment in real balance since the fall of man? Never. Because when Eve and Adam checked out of paradise, they started the survival struggle of mankind. And what has been one of the main elements of that struggle? Yes, it has to keep at the lowest possible level all the fish, birds, and animals which competed with man on the same available food resources which man also would like to have. And they competed on the diet which also was a diet of man. And if you look at the Tana River, man has been present along the Tana River and has been fishing salmon for at least 6,000 years. And by the way, we have about 1,000 different Sami words concerning salmon and salmon fishing. And Tana River is therefore an outstanding example of the struggle which followed the fall of man. But now we are forbidden to struggle or to fight predators anymore. and it looks like the predators are winning. And traditional knowledge is totally set aside as a basis for management of Tana River. So we really need assistance from the indigenous communities and the international society to open the eyes of Finnish and Norwegian authorities. Thank you very much for listening.
Olugito Steinar, thank you so much, Steinar. Now over to our next case. So it's going to be about the Njouta River, and we will welcome Tero Mustonen to the stage. Tero is a Finn, he is our ally, he's the president of Snow Change. I believe you will talk a little bit about snow change in your organization. I will also say that he is a winter sailor and an adjunct professor in human geography and has been working in Alaska, Canada, Greenland, Iceland, Sami territories, as well as Russia North since 1999. I will stop there and give the floor to you. Thanks. And could the next presentation be uploaded to the screen, please?
We greet you, Terve, the Musqueam nation where we are situated today on this extremely important event. I want to recognize all of your traditional territory, your rights, your ancestors, and as a Finnish person coming from a small village of Selkie, we greet you. Let me also recognize at the very beginning of my presentation Grand Chief, former Lieutenant Governor of British Columbia, Chancellor Stephen Point. I thank you for the past 20 years of working together, and I bring you greetings from your Finnish family, friends, and let me also offer our best of greetings and recognition of Gwen, the family, the Skokale, and all of the good people up the river. You are a brother to us, and we salute you. I also want to extend our greetings to the Sami people. It is of utmost humble position to be a Finnish person speaking in front of you today. Steinar Pedersen, I thank you for your presentation. I greet very quickly also the Sami parliaments that are here, Sami parliamentarians, and the president of Sami Council, Aslak Holmberg. He's also a salmon fisherman, a young leader who's standing up for exactly the kind of things that Elder Pedersen was talking about. Camilla, thank you for having us. And finally, I bring you a message from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, where I had the privilege of leading the Arctic and European chapters for the past 5 years. And as a part of that mandate, I tried to incorporate salmon, indigenous rights, and knowledge to the work that the panel was doing on climate change to the best we could. I'm standing here together with many Sami representatives who couldn't join us. I'm just a vehicle of communications, but they are leading the work on Njouta River. First and foremost, in this line, you are seeing the face and smile of one of the elders, Vladimir Fedorov, who is leading the work with Snow Change and the Sami people with her daughter. More about that a bit later. We are traveling across the ocean with a delegation from Snow Change. You may ask, what is Snow Change? Why is it called Snow Change? Who are we? That's Lauri Hämäläinen, who is on our table. He is a young salmon fisherman. Salmonid fishes are coming to him on the ice, and he is one of the future of how Karelian and Finnish communities are trying to maintain all that we are talking about, despite not being indigenous peoples, but having local knowledge. We are also joined by Hal, who is restoring a salmon river in the UK, and Mika Honkalinna, who is our key visual artist. The Sami, Finns, Karelians, Nenets, Komi, and Hanti are part of the non-Indo-European languages of our part of the world. This is a very quick map of who are we. Some of these peoples, and rightly so, have the status of indigenous peoples. Snow Change will continue to honor and support all of those indigenous rights. However, our context is rather unique. For the past 10,000 years, from Western Ural peoples all the way to northern Sweden, these Finno-Ugric nations have depended on exactly what the Grand Chief Point was saying, the salmon and her relations. And in all of those nations' long history, at some point in time, despite the losses, there was the key central notion of respect. And that's what we are trying to rebuild and bring you today. You will hear from the Sami themselves. They are reindeer people, they are salmon people, and they are people of their indigenous world. I will not talk about on their behalf, but I want to introduce the two key other presenters who couldn't be here because of health reasons. On the left, former president of the Sami Council, Pauliina Fedorov, and again, as mentioned, the elder Vladimir Fedorov, who are leading the Nyautam co-management work for the salmon and climate change with Snow Change. I will give you a very quick overview of what are we doing and why it's partly working, what is the key to the survival this century, on the things that Mackenzie and Camilla were talking about. How do the solutions look like in the Skolt Sami and Snow Change context? As we heard before from Steinar, there are no land rights or water rights in Finland to the Sami. But yet, Näätämö, together with Teatnu, Nyautam is one of the key Atlantic salmon home streams in the European North. That's how she looks like, because the Skolt Sami in public discourse have called her a mother. There's a very big notion of how the government looks at this same place. It sees this river as pristine wilderness. Yet it has been heavily impacted over the decades by logging, mining, transport corridors, and there's a gap in understanding on what's going on. Therefore, the Skolt Sami started to think in 2011, when climate change was starting to hit very heavily on these Atlantic salmon waters, what to do. And they partnered and formed teams of leaders, including Teijo here on the right, and Jouko Mosnikov on the left, to know the land. What is the actual baseline? Where are we in this new century? This is a quote from one of the oral histories from Vladimir Fedorov, and it shows exactly the kind of points of respect through the Arctic and North that Grand Chief Point was talking about. You can't muck around with the river. Grandmother Anna of Vladimir said, if there are no salmon, we will cease to be as humans. So when we heard from Chief Point talking about the next 25 years, the 50 years, how will the future be? Let me reaffirm from our collaboration with the Sami the same understanding that if there are no salmon, the people will no longer exist. I have only 2 or 3 slides more, but these are the key points then of what was done based on this realization. And in 2011, the Skolt Sami came to Snow Change and asked, what are the solutions? How could we fight and ultimately move to a place of health regarding salmon. They decided on the very first full-range co-management of Njautam watershed with us. The first thing we did was to establish land use and occupancy studies. Where is the salmon? How are they using the river? In 2013, a decade ago, we were able to present to the world the very first co-management regime for the whole of the river, in effect realizing the Sami rights to salmon for the first time in Finland. In 2015, the political leadership of the Scout Sami decided this co-management regime is the way to go forward, and they validated the work that we had prepared for 5 years with the Sami knowledge holders. And then we got to work. Over the past 6 years, we have moved fast to restore habitats. We have scouted where climate change is hitting the hardest, and we have rebuilt resilience, ecosystems, detected new species, published in peer-reviewed high-powered science journals, and moved on also to the forest question. Perhaps one of the most painful questions the Sami in Finland, as well as the Finnish people that care about the issue, face today is the massive loss of our forests. You know all about that in British Columbia because of the rainforests are gone. Therefore, we have started to explore over the past 2 years the critical link between old-growth forests. We have preserved over 500 hectares and handed over old-growth forest systems in recovery to Sami governance. These are massive realizations of land rights, water rights, and management that has never taken place in Finland before, in practice. And this year, together with Lauri, leading a team with Janne, we have moved on to restore a full spawning lake, the Sevettijauri or Sevettijärvi Lake, to expand Sami indigenous-led governance, restoration, and resilience work to buy more time. What are the results? How is nature responding to these steps? The work led by women, Sami indigenous women and men, together with Snow Change Finns. She has said yes. She has accepted the work we do. Based on the critical evidence on the ground, these are some of the first trout and salmon documented in the fully restored ecosystems that were destroyed by the state of Finland for timber floating. After we have for 5 years restored and nurtured, led by the Sami, back to life. There's no higher proof that I can bring you to this important seminar today that if you work with indigenous peoples and the best of science, nature can be a powerful partner. Nothing stands in your way. Survival becomes possible. Rights are realized. Resilience comes forwards. And we might have a fighting chance this century. So what are the key lessons from our work in conclusion? I know you are anxious for the coffee, so I'll be very quick. We have been able to realize Sami rights and management through rewilding and action on the ground, not only legal fights or building institutional capacity. That is the political arm, but this is the actual rebirth on the ground. We have found out that there are completely novel new science results in peer-reviewed science and also screened by the indigenous peoples in the IPCC, in Science Journal, and many others. I thank Camilla for working with me and the team on some of those critically important messages. Restoration of these destroyed habitats, those 25 streams that Grand Chief Point was talking about, or in that range, led to a key in realizing how forests are also connected with salmon, and this led to the door of over 500 hectares now being under Sami governance on private lands. Climate change is severe. We are seeing the massive fires last year here with the heat dome, 49.6 in Lytton, followed by torrential rains. To quote Chief Point, he saw the Sumas Lake come back to life for the first time, as I recall. Unfortunately, it was an extreme event. But our work buys time despite the massive changes. It may bring ecological safety to people and place and the salmon. Some of the Sami elders, including Vladimir, waited for 40 years for this to happen. It goes on to say, memory matters. Steinar knows about the Teatnu from probably hundreds of years ago, through the oral history and Sami knowledge, I would imagine. Therefore, it doesn't happen in a 2-year project. It doesn't happen in a governmental mission quickly. You have to find new ways, and you have to be humble, you have to listen, and you have to back down and not to impose if you are to succeed and really enable indigenous management. The state of Finland and the agencies have agreed in principle to a central first, which is the restoration of habitats. They haven't agreed on all the points in the co-management yet, but they have agreed as a historic first for the past 5 years on the physical restoration and management of these sites. The only people that had the courage to lead all of it, because we are all damaged, we are all scarred, we are afraid. I'm actually very afraid to speak with you. I was super nervous, and then Camilla said it's okay. Brings to the fore the idea that women had the courage. That lady that I showed you in one of those slides, Pauliina, was the one that told me, this is a mission of peace. And I said, peace on what? Peace between the Finns and the Sami. It starts with the restoration. It starts with the salmon. It moves on to the forests. It will move on to peatlands. But ultimately, after centuries of conflict, misunderstanding, and different pathways, we may have a peace, at least here. Maybe not the government, maybe not the agencies, maybe not the timber companies, but between us, the Scott Sami and snow change on this river, on this stone. And only from that, peace can grow, the real peace that we so urgently need today when people are dying in Ukraine. They are dying in indigenous nations. They are dying all over the world. And we need that peace more than ever before. And that's why I stand in front of you in peace. Thank you.